She was the daughter her own father sat 3 seats away from, the one whose name he changed the subject rather than speak aloud. For 22 years, Lady Clementine Sterne existed at the edges of every room in her father's house, tolerated but never claimed. But on the day the king was crowned, in front of every family who had ever looked past her, the entire hall would freeze at the sound of her name, spoken not in apology this time, but as a declaration no one in that room would ever forget. The candles at Ravensworth Hall always burned lower at the far end of the table, as though even the light understood precisely where it was least welcome and dimmed itself accordingly. Refusing to waste its warmth on a corner the household had silently agreed did not deserve illumination. Lady Clementine Sterne sat there each evening, 3 seats removed from her father, in the place reserved for a guest who had never quite been invited, and yet could not, by any rule of decency, be turned away entirely. She had grown so accustomed to that distance over the years that she no longer measured it in feet or in place settings. She measured it instead in silences, in the particular texture of quiet that settled over the room like a held breath whenever she dared to lift her eyes from her plate and search, foolishly, for some acknowledgement that she existed at all. Her father, Duke Alaric Sterne, spoke that evening to her sister Sabine of the coming season, of eligible correspondence and carefully brokered matches, of the king's failing health, and what it might mean for the calendar of court events in the coming year. And through the whole of it, he did not once turn his head toward the end of the table, where Clementine sat with her hands folded and her spine straight, as though holding herself with dignity might somehow compensate for being spoken around rather than spoken to. 22 years she had lived beneath his roof, and in 22 years she had come to understand that his silence toward her was not, strictly speaking, cruelty. It was something colder and more thoroughly practiced than cruelty. It was the plain, settled absence of any decision to care, worn so smooth by repetition that it no longer required effort on his part at all. When the housekeeper came near the end of the meal to clear away the second course Clementine had barely touched, the older woman paused just a moment longer than was strictly necessary and let her hand rest briefly on Clementine's shoulder. A small, entirely illegal kindness in that house, withdrawn again almost before it had been offered, lest the Duke glance up and find something to disapprove of in it. That single touch, so slight it might have been imagined, would return to Clementine again and again in the colder place she was soon to occupy, as proof, the only proof she would carry with her, that gentleness had once, briefly, existed inside these walls. But that night she only lowered her eyes once more to her untouched plate, and the candles burned on toward morning, indifferent to her, as they always had been. The dowager's cousin, newly arrived from Bath and not yet fluent in the particular grammar of this household's silences, made the mistake that only strangers ever made. She looked too long and too openly at Clementine across the crowded drawing-room, tilting her head with the guileless delight of a woman noticing a resemblance she found charming rather than dangerous, and said brightly to the room at large, "Good heavens! She has the look of the first Duchess entirely, does she not? That same fair hair, that same manner of tilting her chin when she listens." The room did not merely fall quiet at the remark. It went still in the particular way water goes still an instant before it is struck, every conversation arresting mid-syllable, every eye finding somewhere else to rest. Duke Alaric set down his glass with a precision that was, in its own understated way, a small act of violence. No sound louder than crystal meeting polished wood, and yet the whole room felt the force of it. He did not raise his voice. He had never, in Clementine's memory, found it necessary to raise his voice. He simply remarked, with perfect civility, that the resemblance was regrettable, and turned the conversation smoothly toward the weather and the state of the roads. And the cousin, coloring now, beginning to understand at last what unspoken rule she had trespassed against, did not speak Clementine's name again for the remainder of her stay at Ravensworth. It was, Clementine thought privately, watching the subject dissolve into safer topics, the nearest thing to an apology her existence would ever be granted. A conversation redirected on her behalf, as though she herself were the inconvenience requiring management, and not the woman who had simply been noticed for a moment, and then swiftly, efficiently, unnoticed again. Later, in the dim corridor outside the drawing room, Sabine caught her sister's arm. Not unkindly, but with the brisk, practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing an ongoing difficulty rather than comforting a person in pain. "You mustn't let it wound you," she said, in the low, reasonable voice she used for matters she considered already settled. "Father only wishes you would not remind him." Clementine wanted badly to ask what precisely she was meant to do about a face she had never chosen and could not now surrender. What remedy existed for a resemblance written into her bones before she had ever drawn breath? But she had learned long before that night that certain questions were not worth the answers they were likely to earn her, and so she only nodded and let Sabine believe the matter closed, and carried the words with her up the stairs like stones gathered quietly into her pockets. The order arrived without explanation, as nearly every order in that house arrived, delivered through a servant rather than spoken to her face, as though even the giving of instructions required a buffer of distance between her father and herself. Clementine was to remove at once to Thorncliffe, the smallest and least visited of the family's properties, and remain there until after the coronation season's betrothal announcements had been properly settled among families whose good opinion still mattered to her father. No one troubled to tell her that her continued presence in London in these particular weeks had become an embarrassment he could no longer arrange his household around. She understood it regardless, without needing the words spoken plainly. She had, after all, spent a lifetime learning to translate her father's silences with perfect fluency. The carriage departed at dusk, which alone should have warned her that something in this arrangement had been decided with more haste than care. By the time the storm broke fully over the North Road, the coachman could barely make out the swinging lanterns at his own team's heads through the driving sleet, and the ice gathering beneath the wheels had transformed the long, winding descent into Thorn Vale from a road into something closer to a slide, steep and treacherous, and entirely beyond any driver's mastery. Clementine felt the carriage begin to tip before her mind had fully grasped what tipping would mean for her. A long, suspended, almost dreamlike moment in which the whole world simply abandoned its proper angle, followed at once by the violent, bone-jarring rush of the ditch rising up to claim them both. She did not remember the impact itself so much as the silence that followed it. Thicker, stranger, and far more absolute than any silence Ravensworth Hall had ever offered her, broken only by the coachman's low groan somewhere in the darkness, the horses screaming and thrashing against their harnesses, and her own ragged breath catching sharply against what she would only later learn were two cracked ribs beneath her stays. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that frightened her considerably more than the pain did, that if she were to die quietly in this frozen ditch, several days would very likely pass before anyone at Ravensworth thought to inquire after where she had gone, or whether she had arrived at all. He emerged from the storm as though the storm itself had shaped him into being. A tall silhouette first against the driving sleet, then a voice, low and entirely unhurried, in a manner that seemed almost wrong for the violence of the circumstances surrounding them both. "Don't move yet," he said, kneeling beside the wreckage before she had even managed to open her eyes fully against the freezing rain. "Tell me your name, if you're able." When she gave it, faint and trembling, He did not repeat it back to her with the careful, deliberate weight her name usually carried inside her father's house, as though it were a fact requiring careful handling. He simply nodded, absorbed it, and moved directly to the work of freeing her from the crushed door, as though hers were an entirely ordinary name belonging to an entirely ordinary woman who deserved exactly the same swift, unhesitating care as any other soul pulled broken from an overturned carriage on a black winter road. His hands, when they found the sharp catch of pain along her side, moved with a steadiness that spoke of some prior, hard-won acquaintance with disaster, not the tentative, apologetic fumbling of a gentleman unaccustomed to the sight of blood, but the sure, economical, almost wordless competence of a man who had done this precise work before, likely in far worse conditions, for stakes far higher than a lady's overturned carriage. He introduced himself only as Gabriel, offering no surname, no mention of house or lineage or the road he had been traveling when the crash reached his ears through the storm. In the world Clementine had been raised within, a man without a surname was scarcely a man at all. He was an absence dressed as a person. And yet she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she trusted the steadiness of his hands long before she thought to question the silence surrounding everything else about him. He carried her when the coachman could not be roused from his injuries, and the second horse had bolted screaming into the dark, nearly a full mile through freezing rain, toward the only shelter he knew of near that stretch of road. A gamekeeper's cottage, small and cold and long since fallen into disuse, but dry and standing and enough. He did not once complain of the distance, nor of her weight against a body already soaked entirely through, nor of the ruin being made of his own greatcoat, which clung now to shoulders that seemed, in the dim and shifting light, built for precisely this kind of burden and no other. By the time he had laid her gently before the cold hearth and begun coaxing a stubborn fire from wet kindling with patient, practiced hands, Clementine understood, with a certainty she could not yet fully name, that something inside her had shifted that the accident alone could never account for. She might have asked, in another life entirely, the life of a favored daughter, a woman whose curiosity had been indulged rather than quietly corrected out of her from childhood. She certainly would have asked, and asked plainly, and expected an honest answer in return. But Clementine had spent 22 years learning with great precision exactly which questions were permitted to a person of her particular, uncertain standing within her own family, and who are you, truly had never once been among them. And so instead of asking, she watched him coax the small fire into something steady and warm, studied the quiet, unhurried economy of his every movement, and told herself simply that his name was Gabriel, and that for tonight, in this cold and borrowed room, that single fact would have to be enough to build her trust upon. He asked nothing of her in return that a lady of any station could have taken offense at. No inquiry into which family she belonged to, no visible calculation crossing his features at the fineness of her ruined traveling gown, even in its torn and muddied state. No flicker of recognition or ambition at the mention of the stern name, which she had given him plainly enough when introducing herself. He asked only whether the pain along her side worsened when she breathed too deeply, whether she could still feel sensation in her fingers, whether the cold had settled too far into her before he'd reached her. And each question was so entirely, singularly concerned with her survival, and nothing beyond it, that something long wound tight in Clementine's chest began, slowly, to loosen. In a way it had not loosened since long before that carriage had ever left the gates of Ravensworth Hall. Once, reaching past her to bank the fire higher against the night's growing cold, his greatcoat fell open at the collar, and she caught the briefest glint of something worn on a cord beneath his shirt. old metal, dulled by years and handling, the unmistakable kind of object a man does not wear carelessly or without reason. He noticed her noticing it, and for the first time since he had pulled her bodily from the wreckage of the ditch, something closed behind his eyes, quick and deliberate as a door shutting somewhere deep inside a house with many locked rooms she was not yet permitted to enter. He said nothing to explain it, and Clementine, sensing the exact shape and weight of a boundary she had no earned right yet to cross, said nothing further either, and let the silence settle back between them, undisturbed. 3 full days passed before anyone at Ravensworth Hall thought even to send word ahead to Thorncliffe inquiring after her delayed arrival, and by the time such word finally came, Clementine had already begun healing in ways that had very little to do with the mending of her ribs. The gamekeeper's cottage was small, plain, and entirely unconcerned with rank or resemblance or the careful architecture of who deserved to be seen and who did not. There was no far end of a table here, no chair reserved for the guest nobody had properly invited. There was only a narrow room, a low and steady fire, and Gabriel, who came each morning without fail to check the binding at her side, and remained afterward, more often than either of them cared to acknowledge aloud, considerably longer than any strict sense of duty could have required of him. He offered her, in careful measures, small true things about himself, details rationed out like a man uncertain how long his own supplies of honesty might need to last. He had served abroad, in a war that had clearly taken from him more than he was willing to name outright, and had returned to England, with no fixed household to speak of, and no particular urgency to acquire one. He read, when she caught him unguarded at it by lamplight some evenings, with the fluent, unconscious ease of a man who had been taught his letters properly and young. A detail she noted quietly and did not remark upon, filing it away beside the glint of metal at his collar and the deliberate stillness with which he carried his whole body, like evidence gathering slowly toward some larger conclusion she was not yet permitted to reach on her own. In turn, she found herself offering him things she had never once spoken aloud within her father's hearing. What it truly meant to resemble a dead woman, no one in that house would name directly. What it cost a person to be merely tolerated rather than wanted. What it felt like to learn, from earliest childhood, that her own chair at the family table existed only because its removal would have demanded an explanation her father preferred never to give. Gabriel listened to the whole of it without the wince she had long since come to expect from anyone who heard her account in full. He simply listened, attentive and unhurried, as though her worth were not a question requiring his careful opinion at all, but rather a settled fact he had recognized from the very first night, and saw no reason whatsoever to reconsider. But comfort, however hard-won, rarely arrives without its price, and hers was already riding hard toward the cottage door. It happened on an evening otherwise unremarkable, over nothing grander than bread and a thin, simple broth he had made himself, having firmly refused to let the gamekeeper's young daughter trouble herself over what he called, with quiet finality, no trouble at all. He set the bowl before Clementine and did not linger to be thanked for it, did not glance toward her expectantly awaiting gratitude, did not perform the small kindness in any manner that required her thanks to complete its meaning. He simply did the thing, plainly and without ceremony, and moved on to banking the fire for the night, as though caring for her comfort were not some gift graciously bestowed, but merely the correct and unremarkable order of any ordinary evening between two people sharing a roof. Clementine found, to her own considerable and quiet astonishment, that she wept. Not loudly, not in the manner designed to invite comfort or demand explanation from another soul, but privately, suddenly, in the startled way a person weeps upon encountering something they had long ago stopped believing could still exist in the world for them. She could not explain to him, Not fully, not yet, that she had built the entire architecture of her adult life around the settled expectation of being an inconvenience to everyone she loved, and that his utter, unthinking refusal to treat her as one had undone something in her more thoroughly and more permanently than the carriage accident itself ever could have managed. Gabriel did not press her to explain herself. He only settled beside her, near enough that she could feel the steady warmth radiating from him, and allowed the silence between them to become, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, a comfortable one. It was into that fragile, unguarded quiet that the knock finally came. A rider up from Ravensworth, mud to his knees and his horse blown hard from the distance, bearing a letter sealed with her father's crest and words that would, within the week, unmake entirely whatever this small borrowed room had allowed her to become. Gabriel read the sudden tightening in her shoulders before she had even broken the seal to learn what it contained, and something passed behind his eyes once more. Not the closed door of before, but something nearer to dread. Something that looked, for just a moment, almost like fear on her behalf. Whatever the letter held, he understood its shape before she did. That it would ask of her something this cold, small, safe cottage could never fully protect her from. The letter, when Clementine finally broke her father's seal with fingers that would not quite stop trembling, contained no tenderness and no inquiry after her health. Only the flat, administrative language of a man settling an unwanted account. She was to return to Ravensworth within the fortnight, in time to be presented properly before the coronation season concluded, so that the betrothal so long assumed between the houses of Sterne and Bramfield might finally be made formal and binding. There was no question posed anywhere in those lines, no room left for refusal, only the calm, terrible assumption that her consent had never been a factor requiring consideration in the first place, any more than the consent of a piece of furniture is consulted before it is moved to a more convenient room. What her father did not write, what he had never written and never would, was the true architecture beneath the arrangement. That Clementine's resemblance to the first Duchess was not merely an unfortunate accident of inheritance, but a living accusation the Duke had spent 2 decades trying to quiet. The first Duchess, Clementine's mother, had not simply died as the household's careful language always implied. She had fled first, in the year before her death, from a match her own family had arranged with a cruelty dressed as duty. And the scandal of that flight, however briefly and thoroughly it had been buried beneath money and silence, had never fully stopped breathing beneath the surface of Ravensworth's good name. Clementine's face, so precisely her mother's face, had become for Alaric Sterne a mirror he could not bear to look into directly, and a debt he had long ago decided his daughter would be the one to finish paying. She understood this without needing it explained, in the way she understood most things in that house, not through conversation, which was rarely offered her, but through the accumulated weight of 22 years spent watching a door close each time she entered a room. The Bramfield match, she realized now, reading the letter a second time by the cottage's low fire, had never been about her at all. It was reparation, arranged in advance, for a shame that predated her own birth by years, settled at last upon the one person in the family too powerless to refuse the paying of it. Gabriel had left that morning before dawn, called away on some errand he had not explained and she had not pressed him to justify, and Clementine had spent the day alone with the letter and the fire, and the particular quality of dread that comes from knowing precisely what is being asked of you and precisely how little say you have been granted in the asking. She had expected him back near dusk, as he usually returned, unhurried and unremarkable against the darkening sky. Instead, she heard the horse well before the light had properly failed, driven hard up the lane in a manner entirely unlike the measured pace he ordinarily kept, and she was on her feet and at the door before she had fully decided to rise at all. He came in with rain still clinging to his shoulders and something urgent and unreadable moving behind his eyes, and before she had said a single word about the letter folded now inside her sleeve, he asked her directly whether a rider from the south had come to Thorncliffe that day. The precision of the question startled her more than its content. Not has anyone troubled you? Not the vague, useless concern of a man guessing at danger, but the exact, informed question of someone who already knew, or feared he knew, precisely what shape that danger would take and from which direction it would arrive. She told him of the letter then, watching his face as she spoke of Bramfield's name and the coronation deadline and her father's flat, administrative cruelty, and she saw something settle behind his expression that she could not yet name. Not surprise, which frightened her more than surprise would have, but a kind of grim, private confirmation, as though a fear he had been carrying silently for days had simply been given its proper shape at last. Bramfield, he repeated once, quietly, testing the name as one tests the weight of a stone before deciding whether it can be safely lifted. He did not explain what the name meant to him, but something in the careful stillness with which he received it told her, with growing unease, that it meant a great deal more to him than it should have to a man with no surname and no fixed household of his own. For 3 days after the letter arrived, Clementine carried a single question everywhere she went inside that small cottage, turning it over in her mind at the hearth, at the narrow window, in the long silences while Gabriel changed the binding at her side with hands that had grown gentler with practice rather than less careful. She wanted desperately to ask him to help her refuse the marriage entirely, to ask whether a man who moved through the world with such quiet, unexplained authority might know some path by which a woman of no fortune and less standing could simply disappear from an arrangement already sealed by 2 families and a king's approaching coronation. But asking would mean admitting how thoroughly she had come to depend on him in the space of a fortnight, and admitting that felt more dangerous, somehow, than the marriage itself. She watched him instead, across the small room, for some sign that he wished her to ask, some flicker of invitation that would grant her permission to voice the thing pressing so hard against her ribs it had begun to rival the ache of her healing bones. He gave her, instead, only careful, deliberate distance, as though he too were guarding against a question he was not yet prepared to answer honestly. And the space between them, which had felt so warm and unguarded only days before, took on the particular tension of 2 people circling the edge of a conversation neither dared begin. It was Gabriel in the end who broke first, though not with the words she had feared or hoped for. "You needn't decide anything tonight," he said, banking the fire with more care than the task strictly required, not meeting her eyes directly. "Whatever comes from Ravensworth, you are not without choices simply because your father has chosen to pretend otherwise." It was not the offer she had wanted, almost, but it was, she realized, turning the words over long after he had gone quiet. The first time in her entire life that anyone had told her plainly that a choice existed for her at all, and something in her chest cracked quietly open at the sheer novelty of being believed capable of choosing. The second letter arrived with considerably less patience than the first, carried by a rider who did not trouble to dismount fully before pressing the sealed paper into the gamekeeper's daughter's hands and departing again into the gray afternoon, as though even the errand itself had been deemed beneath proper ceremony. This letter dispensed with the careful administrative language of the first entirely. It stated, in her father's own unmistakable hand, rather than a secretary's careful copy, that Lord Anselm Kavanagh, Earl of Bramfield, would arrive at Ravensworth within the week to finalize the settlement in person, and that Clementine's continued absence at Thorncliffe had become, in her father's words, an inconvenience he would no longer permit to persist. Beneath the demand for her return lay something colder still, a line, brief and almost careless in its cruelty, noting that the Earl had been made aware of certain irregularities in her recent whereabouts, and that further delay on her part risked complications neither family could afford to entertain so near the coronation. Clementine read the word irregularities 3 times before she understood its full weight. Her father was not merely summoning her home, he was warning her, in the coldest language available to him, that her time at this cottage, and whatever protection or comfort she had found within it, had already been observed, catalogued, and would shortly be used against her if she did not comply. She showed the letter to Gabriel that evening with hands that had gone entirely steady, past the point of trembling, in the particular calm that sometimes follows genuine fear. He read it twice, his jaw tightening at the mention of irregularities in a way she had not seen from him before. And when he finally looked up from the page, something had changed in his face. Not fear exactly, though fear moved somewhere beneath it, but the settled, deliberate expression of a man recalculating the full cost of a decision he had already, silently, made some days earlier. He told her the truth of it that night, or as much of the truth as he seemed prepared to surrender in a single sitting. And Clementine listened with a stillness that surprised even herself, as though some part of her had already suspected the shape of what he was about to say, long before he found the words to say it properly. The marriage to Bramfield, he explained, had been arranged not in the recent weeks the letters implied, but years earlier, quietly, as settlement for a debt her father had incurred long before Clementine came of age to marry at all. A debt tied, in ways he did not yet fully explain, to the same old scandal surrounding her mother's flight and death. A debt Bramfield's own family had been patiently, coldly waiting to collect against the Sterne name for the better part of 2 decades. "You were never meant to refuse it," he said quietly, watching the fire rather than her face, as though the admission cost him something to make plainly. "The arrangement was settled before you were old enough to understand what was being settled on your behalf. Your father did not summon you home to negotiate, Clementine. He summoned you home to deliver on a promise he made long before either of us were in a position to prevent it." The use of her full name, spoken so rarely and so carefully by him until that moment, landed with a weight she had not expected, as though even her own name had become, in his mouth, something worth handling gently. What he did not yet explain, what she would only understand fully in the weeks that followed. Once the coronation had drawn every relevant party into a single gilded room, and the truth could no longer be managed by careful letters and quiet arrangements, was precisely how he had come to know the particulars of a debt so deeply buried within her father's private affairs that even Clementine, raised inside that very house, had never once heard its true shape spoken aloud. She understood only, watching him in the firelight that night, that whatever he was not telling her mattered a great deal more than the marriage itself, and that the question she had been too afraid to ask him directly was rapidly becoming the only question that mattered at all. She wrote her answer to Ravensworth the following morning, before she had fully reasoned through what such an answer might cost her, driven less by careful strategy than by the sudden, fierce clarity that comes to a person who has spent a lifetime being decided for and finds, unexpectedly, that she still possesses a voice capable of deciding for herself. She would not return to marry the Earl of Bramfield, the letter stated plainly, in her own hand, rather than through any intermediary, and she would not apologize for a debt incurred before her birth, by circumstances she had never been permitted to understand, let alone consent to settle. She did not yet know, sealing that letter with trembling but resolved hands, that her refusal would reach Ravensworth on the very afternoon Lord Cavanagh arrived to finalize the arrangement in person, nor that her father's fury at the public humiliation of a broken settlement, discovered before his own guest, would exceed anything she had previously witnessed from a man she had always believed incapable of further coldness toward her. She did not know that Sabine, caught between loyalty to their father and a dawning unease about the whole arrangement, would be forbidden even to write to her in the weeks that followed. She knew only, sending the letter off with the same writer who had delivered her father's threats, that for the first time in her life she had chosen something for herself, and that the choosing alone felt like enough to justify whatever storm followed it. Gabriel, reading her resolve in the set of her shoulders when she returned from dispatching the letter, said nothing to dissuade her, though something moved behind his eyes that she would later recognize as the particular fear of a man who understood, far better than she did in that moment, exactly how high the cost of her defiance was likely to climb. "Whatever comes of this," he said finally, taking her hand in both of his with a gravity she had not seen from him before, "you will not face it as you have faced everything else, alone." She did not yet know what that promise would eventually require of him, nor what it would reveal. She knew only that she believed him, entirely and without reservation, and that belief itself felt like the first true shelter she had ever been offered. She would not learn until later how much her single, quiet refusal had already set in motion, nor how soon it would force a stranger's silence into the open. It was Sabine's smuggled note, arriving nearly a week later by a servant girl paid handsomely for her discretion, that first forced Clementine to reckon properly with how little she truly understood about the man who had pulled her from a ditch and never once asked for anything in return. Her sister wrote in a hurried, frightened hand that their father, upon learning of the refusal, had made discreet inquiries into the identity of the stranger reportedly sheltering her at Thorncliffe, and that those inquiries, quietly pursued through connections at court, had returned answers vague enough to alarm rather than reassure him. No one, it seemed, could confirm precisely who Gabriel was, and yet several among the Duke's own circle had reacted to a careful description of him with a caution that suggested they knew rather more than they were willing to say plainly. When Clementine pressed him that evening, gently but without her earlier hesitation, Gabriel answered her questions about the coronation's political arrangements, the delicate balancing of debts and alliances among the peerage, the precise mechanics by which a family like Bramfield's might press an old claim against a family like her father's, even details of protocol surrounding the coronation ceremony itself that a common soldier, however well read, had no plausible reason to know with such fluent, unthinking precision. He answered each question correctly, thoroughly, and with a growing discomfort that told her, more clearly than any confession could have, that he was aware of exactly how much his own knowledge was beginning to reveal about him. "You know a great deal for a man with no surname," she said finally, quietly, watching him rather than the fire for once. He was silent long enough that she thought he might simply let the observation pass unanswered, as he had let so many things pass unanswered before. But at last he met her eyes directly, and something in his expression carried the particular weight of a man standing at the very edge of a truth he had been postponing for reasons she did not yet understand. "There are things about me," he said slowly, "that I have not told you, Clementine. Not because I do not trust you, because once you know them, I am not certain you will be permitted to choose me at all." He said nothing further that night, but the sentence stayed with her long after the fire had burned down to embers, the first crack in a silence that would not hold much longer. The thaw came early that year, unseasonably so, and with it the small, overgrown garden behind the gamekeeper's cottage began pushing green shoots up through soil that had been frozen hard as stone for the better part of 2 months, as though the earth itself had grown impatient with waiting for spring to arrive on schedule. Clementine took to walking there each afternoon once her ribs had healed enough to permit it, drawn less by any particular fondness for gardening than by the simple, novel pleasure of a space that belonged to no one's careful accounting of her worth. A patch of tangled earth where she could kneel in the dirt and pull weeds with her own two hands and answer to nobody's expectations at all. Gabriel found her there on an afternoon warm enough to work without her shawl, and instead of retreating as he sometimes did when he found her absorbed in some private occupation, he knelt beside her among the overturned soil and began, without being asked, to help clear the tangled growth from what had once clearly been a proper flower-bed. They worked in a companionable silence that had become, over the preceding weeks, entirely comfortable between them, until Clementine, emboldened perhaps by the softness of the afternoon light or the strange, unguarded ease of working the earth alongside him, found herself speaking aloud, thoughts she had never once permitted herself to voice to another living soul. That she sometimes wondered whether her mother had felt this same tangled mixture of relief and terror in the last months before she fled the marriage arranged for her, whether flight had felt, to her mother, like this, like green things pushing up through frozen ground against every reasonable expectation that they should remain buried. Gabriel went very still at that, his hands motionless in the dark soil, and for a long moment Clementine thought she had finally said too much, revealed some private grief he had no wish to carry alongside his own. But when he looked up, his expression held none of the retreat she had braced herself against. "Your mother," he said carefully, each word chosen with a precision that made her breath catch somewhere beneath her ribs, "was braver than most of the men I have known at court, who call themselves brave for far smaller acts of defiance." It was the first time he had ever referenced the court directly, unprompted, without her having first pressed him toward the subject, and something in the ease of the reference, as though he moved through that world naturally rather than merely observing it from some safe remove, very nearly drew the question from her at last. She opened her mouth to ask him finally, plainly, who he truly was, and it was in that exact moment, before the question could fully form itself into words, that the gamekeeper's daughter came running down the garden path with news that scattered the moment entirely. Riders had been sighted on the North Road, moving fast, and flying a standard neither of them could yet make out clearly enough to name. The riders proved, in the end, to be nothing more sinister than a party of the Duke's own men sent to assess whether Thorncliff's roof required repair before the coronation season concluded, and the estate's accounts were settled for the year. A mundane errand that had nothing whatsoever to do with Clementine's continued refusal of the Bramfield match, but the fright of it lingered regardless, and within it, unexpectedly, arrived a second smuggled letter from Sabine, delivered this time by one of the estate men himself, who had been paid, evidently, to carry more than roofing assessments back to Ravensworth. Sabine's letter carried none of the careful loyalty to their father that had marked her earlier correspondence. Something had shifted in the intervening weeks, Clementine understood, reading her sister's increasingly urgent hand. Sabine had overheard, by accident or design, a conversation between their father and Lord Kavanagh that troubled her considerably more than Clementine's simple refusal of the match ever had. The Earl, it seemed, had grown less interested in the marriage itself than in the identity of the man reportedly sheltering her, and had begun making inquiries of his own through channels that had nothing to do with the peerage, and everything to do, Sabine wrote with visible alarm, with the king's own household staff. "I do not know what you have found at Thorncliff or who," Sabine's letter continued, the ink blotted here and there as though written in some haste or distress, but Kavanagh spoke your stranger's description to father with a certainty that frightened me more than anything father himself has said in years. He called him dangerous to acknowledge. I do not know what that means, Clementine. but I beg you to ask him plainly who he is before matters proceed further, whatever the cost of the asking." Clementine folded the letter with hands that had begun, for the first time in weeks, to tremble again, and understood that the question she had nearly asked in the garden that afternoon could no longer be safely postponed. Whatever careful reasons Gabriel might offer for continuing to withhold his answer. The gamekeeper's daughter, a quiet girl named Bess, who had grown fond of Clementine over the preceding weeks, in the particular unguarded way servants sometimes grow fond of guests who treat them as people rather than furniture, came to her one evening with a hesitation that immediately put Clementine on her guard. The estate men who had come to assess the roof, Bess explained carefully, had not confined their conversation entirely to matters of thatch and timber. Two of them, believing themselves unobserved in the stable yard, had spoken in low voices of the gentleman staying at the cottage, and one had said, with a certainty that unsettled even Bess in the retelling, that he recognized the man's bearing from somewhere he could not quite place, somewhere that had nothing to do with soldiering or gamekeeping at all. He said it was the way he stood, Bess reported, twisting her apron in her hands with the particular discomfort of a girl repeating gossip she suspected mattered more than gossip usually did. "Not proud exactly, but settled," he said, "like a man used to rooms turning quiet when he enters them." He said he'd seen that particular stillness only once before, years back, at a distance, when he'd gone up to London on an errand for the old Duke and stood at the edge of a crowd that had gathered to watch a procession pass. Bess did not know, or would not say, precisely which procession or which figure within it had struck the estate man as familiar. And Clementine understood, listening to the halting account, that Bess herself had likely been given only half the story. Filtered already through servants' hall caution about repeating anything too specific regarding a guest who might, for all anyone below stairs truly knew, hold more power than his plain dress suggested. That evening, watching Gabriel across the small room as he read by lamplight with the same fluent, unconscious ease she had noted weeks before and filed carefully away, Clementine found she could no longer look at the simple details of him. The quality of his boots beneath their travel-worn leather, the particular economy of his speech, the metal at his collar he had never once explained. Without seeing them now as evidence rather than mere character, pieces of a puzzle Bess's servants' hall gossip had only sharpened rather than solved. She said nothing of what Bess had told her that night, but something in her had shifted permanently toward the question Sabine's letter had urged her to ask, and she understood that the asking, however delayed, could not now be postponed much further. It was a stray remark from Gabriel himself, offered without apparent calculation on an otherwise unremarkable evening, that finally cracked open the edge of what he had been so carefully withholding. Speaking of her father's finances, a subject Clementine had touched on only obliquely, curious how much he truly understood of the Bramfield settlement's origins, Gabriel mentioned, almost in passing, a sum of money and a year that made Clementine go very still where she sat. It was a debt she had never heard named directly in her father's house. A debt incurred, she now understood from the careless precision of Gabriel's mention. Not by her father's general mismanagement of the estate, but by a specific, deliberate wager made against the Bramfield family nearly 20 years earlier. In the same season her mother had fled the marriage that would have bound the two houses together long before Clementine's own birth. "How do you know that figure?" she asked quietly, setting down the mending in her lap with hands gone suddenly careful and precise. When even Sabine, raised inside that house her whole life, has never once heard it spoken aloud. Gabriel's silence in response to the question stretched long enough that she understood, before he said a single word, that he had made an error he had not intended to make. Some small slip in the careful management of what he had and had not chosen to reveal to her over the preceding weeks. Because the debt was not only your father's to carry, he said finally, each word measured with obvious care. It touched my family as well, in ways I have not yet found the right moment to explain to you properly. The admission landed strangely between them, raising more questions than it settled, and Clementine felt, for the first time since the night of the accident, something that was not quite fear but stood adjacent to it. The dawning, uncomfortable understanding that whatever brought Gabriel to that stretch of the North Road on the night of her overturned carriage might not have been the pure accident of circumstance she had assumed it to be all along. "You knew who I was," she said slowly, watching his face for confirmation she was not certain she wanted. "Before the carriage overturned, you already knew my name and my father's debts and Bramfield's claim against them." Gabriel did not deny it. He only closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing himself against a reckoning he had long known was coming, and said, quietly, that yes, he had known considerably more than he had ever let her believe, and that the time for explaining all of it, however painful the telling might prove, had finally, fully arrived. She did not go looking for it deliberately, or so she told herself afterward, turning the moment over with the particular guilt of someone who has stumbled onto a truth they suspect they were never meant to find so plainly. Gathering his greatcoat from where it hung near the hearth to mend a torn seam at the shoulder, a small, ordinary kindness she had performed for him several times over the preceding weeks without thought. Her fingers caught against something hard, sewn carefully into the coat's inner lining, a weight that did not belong to any greatcoat a common soldier might reasonably own, hidden with a deliberateness that suggested concealment rather than mere carelessness. The ring, when she finally worked it free from its careful stitching, was heavier and finer than anything she had expected. Gold worn smooth with age and use, bearing a crest she recognized instantly and with a lurch of understanding that stole the breath entirely from her chest. Not Gabriel's invented anonymity, but a crest belonging to one of the oldest houses in England, a family whose name she had heard spoken at Ravensworth's own dinner table with the particular reverence reserved for bloodlines older and grander than her father's own. It was, she understood at once, a signet ring, the kind worn only by men who possessed titles substantial enough to require sealing important documents in their own right. Precisely the kind of object a soldier with no surname and no fixed household had no earthly reason to be carrying hidden inside the lining of his coat. She was still holding it, turning the cold gold slowly between her fingers, when Gabriel returned from the stable and found her there, and the expression that crossed his face at the sight of the ring in her open palm was unlike anything she had yet seen from him. Not merely caught, though there was certainly that, but something nearer to grief, as though the ring's discovery closed a door he had been holding open by sheer force of will for longer than he could sustain it. "Clementine," he said, and stopped. And for the first time since the night he had pulled her from the ditch, she watched a man who had never once faltered in her presence search visibly, painfully, for words equal to the moment finally arriving between them. He told her everything then, seated across from her at the small table where they had shared so many quiet meals, speaking with the careful, measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed this confession many times in his own mind, and found, now that the moment had finally come, that none of his rehearsals had adequately prepared him for the weight of saying it aloud. He was not, and had never been, a common soldier without house or name. He was Gabriel Ashworth, Earl of Rendlesham, a title he had held since his father's death some years before, and a name that carried, among its considerable obligations, a long and complicated history entangled with both the Sterne family's old debt and the Bramfield claim currently pressing so hard against Clementine's own future. He had come to that stretch of the North Road, he admitted, not entirely by accident on the night of her carriage's overturning, though the accident itself had been genuine enough. He had been traveling, in fact, toward Ravensworth itself, intending to intervene privately in the Bramfield settlement before it could be finalized. Having learned through channels of his own that the debt underpinning the match was one his own family bore partial responsibility for, incurred by his late father's involvement in the same reckless wager that had ruined her father decades before. He had meant, he said, to resolve the matter quietly, discreetly, without ever needing to involve Clementine directly at all, until he found her carriage overturned in a ditch on the very road he traveled, and every careful plan he had made collapsed instantly beneath the simpler, more urgent obligation of pulling a stranger from the wreckage and ensuring she survived the night. I told myself in the beginning that withholding my name protected you, he said, and for the first time she heard something close to shame beneath the careful measure of his voice. That if Bramfield or your father learned an earl was sheltering you, it would only complicate matters further. Draw attention neither of us wanted, but the longer I stayed silent, the more I understood that I was protecting myself as much as you. Protecting whatever this had become between us from the moment you learned precisely how tangled my family's history is with the very debt destroying your own. Clementine sat very still throughout the whole of it, feeling something crack open inside her chest that she could not yet name plainly. Not merely betrayal, though betrayal moved somewhere within it, but a grief for the simple, unranked version of him she had allowed herself to trust so completely, and the growing, uneasy understanding that the man before her now carried consequences and obligations far beyond anything a gamekeeper's cottage could contain. Some doors, once closed, seemed final. Ravensworth's gates were about to prove otherwise, and not gently. She did not weep, and she did not shout, though some distant part of her recognized that either response might have been simpler to manage than the cold, careful stillness that settled over her instead. "You let me believe," she said finally, each word deliberate, "that I was trusted with the truth of you. That whatever this was between us existed outside the weight of names and titles and old family debts, and instead I find you have been managing me the same way my own father manages me, deciding, on my behalf, what I am and am not permitted to know." Gabriel did not defend himself against the accusation, which somehow made it land harder rather than softer, as though his silence confirmed the fairness of the charge more thoroughly than any explanation could have. "I understand if you cannot forgive the withholding," he said quietly, and there was no plea in his voice, only a grim, resigned acceptance that seemed to cost him considerably more than anger would have. "But I would ask you to understand that everything else, every hour spent at this hearth, every truth I told you about my own grief, my own family, my own uncertain place in the world, none of that was managed or performed. The name I withheld, the man you came to know, was entirely real. Clementine wanted badly to believe him, and the wanting itself frightened her nearly as much as the discovery of the ring had. The recognition that even now, knowing what she knew, some stubborn part of her remained unwilling to surrender the trust she had built with him these past weeks. She rose instead of answering, needing distance more than she needed further words, and crossed to the narrow window where the last gray light of evening was fading toward full dark over the garden they had worked together only days before. "I need time," she said finally, without turning to face him, "to understand what is left of what I believed I knew." Gabriel did not follow her. did not press for more than she had offered, though she felt the whole weight of his stillness behind her, like a door closing quietly between two rooms that had, until this evening, stood open to one another without reservation. Neither of them spoke again that night. And when the second summons arrived from Ravensworth 2 mornings later, this time bearing not her father's seal, but a formal notice of the Coronation Court's demand that both the Sterne and Rendlesham names present themselves before the king within the week, Clementine understood that whatever remained unresolved between them would now be settled not in the privacy of a borrowed cottage, but in the full, unforgiving light of a royal court. The formal notice arrived not as a request, but as a directive bearing the unmistakable weight of royal protocol, sealed with an authority that superseded even her father's considerable will, and Clementine understood. Reading it by the gray morning light with Gabriel standing silent at her shoulder, that whatever privacy their fractured trust had still hoped to preserve was no longer a possibility either of them could claim. Both the House of Sterne and the House of Rendlesham were required to present themselves before the king within the week. The notice stated, the old debt between the two families having come, through channels neither Clementine nor her father had orchestrated, to the direct attention of the crown itself in the delicate weeks preceding the coronation, when every outstanding matter of honor among the peerage was customarily settled before the ceremony proceeded. Gabriel read the notice twice in silence before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice carried none of the careful evasion she had grown accustomed to over the preceding fortnight, only a grim clarity that told her he understood precisely what forces had converged to bring this reckoning forward at last. Chicaque, Bramfield has grown impatient, he said quietly, setting the paper down with a care that seemed almost ceremonial. He has petitioned the crown directly, hoping a royal command will accomplish what your refusal has denied him privately. A settlement finalized under pressure no family, however proud, can easily refuse. He did not need to explain further what such a settlement, forced now under the full weight of royal authority, would mean for Clementine's future should the old debt be allowed to stand unchallenged before the king. What neither of them said aloud, though both understood it plainly as they prepared for the journey to court, was that this summons offered something the cottage's quiet privacy never could have, a stage broad enough and witnessed enough that whatever truth finally emerged between them could not afterward be quietly buried or managed away by careful letters and closed doors. Clementine dressed that morning in the plainest gown she owned, unwilling to borrow any false elegance for a reckoning she intended to face as precisely who she was, and found Gabriel waiting for her by the carriage in traveling clothes, considerably finer than any she had yet seen him wear. The first visible acknowledgment, however small, that the man riding beside her to Ravensworth carried a name the world would very shortly be required to recognize in full. Ravensworth Hall received her not as a daughter returning home, but as a problem finally cornered, and Duke Alaric Sterne met her in the same cold drawing-room where the dowager's cousin had once spoken her mother's resemblance aloud, his expression carrying none of the practiced indifference she had spent a lifetime learning to translate. But something sharper now, more urgent, the visible strain of a man who understood the crown's involvement, had removed from his hands the quiet control he had always relied upon to manage his family's inconvenient truths. "You will end this defiance before we reach court," he said, without preamble, without even the formality of greeting her properly after weeks of absence. "Or you will watch the Rendlesham name destroyed alongside whatever remains of this family's honor, and you will have accomplished nothing beyond ensuring both our ruins together." Clementine listened to the full weight of his demand with a stillness that surprised even herself. The old fear that had governed every interaction with this man for 22 years, notably absent from her chest for the first time in memory. "You mean Rendlesham's debt will be exposed?" she said finally, meeting his eyes directly in a manner she had never before permitted herself in his presence. The same debt you have spent 20 years ensuring nobody spoke of at your own table. You are not afraid of my ruin, father. You are afraid the Coronation Court will finally learn precisely what you did to secure Bramfield's silence, and precisely what it cost my mother to discover it before I did. Something moved across her father's face at that. Not quite shock, but the particular flinch of a man unaccustomed to being seen so plainly by a daughter he had spent decades ensuring remained unseen entirely. He did not deny it, which told her more than any confession could have, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them entirely unlike the silences she had endured at his table for so many years. This one charged with something nearer to reckoning than dismissal. "Your mother," he said finally, so quietly she nearly missed it, "believed she could refuse this family's arrangements too, and see what it cost her." It was the closest thing to an admission of his own cruelty she had ever heard from him, and rather than wounding her, as it once might have, Clementine found it only confirmed what she had already come to understand in the cottage's quiet rooms these past weeks. That his coldness toward her had never truly been about her resemblance to her mother at all, but about his own inability to face what that resemblance forced him to remember about his own failures. "Then I will not make her mistake of believing refusal must be made alone," she said, and left him standing in the cold drawing room, understanding for the first time in her life that his silence no longer held the power over her it once had. The night before the coronation, Gabriel came to the small chamber Clementine had been given at Ravensworth, carrying a coat she had never seen him wear before. Not the travel-worn greatcoat that had sheltered her through the storm and carried, hidden in its lining, the ring that had finally forced his truth into the open, but something altogether different, dark and formally cut, bearing at the shoulder an insignia she recognized now as belonging properly to the Earl of Rendlesham, rather than to the anonymous soldier who had pulled her from a ditch weeks before. He stood in her doorway, holding it as though it weighed considerably more than mere fabric, and something in his expression told her he understood precisely what wearing it tomorrow would mean, not only for himself, but for whatever remained fragile and unresolved between them. "I have worn this coat exactly once before tonight," he said, setting it carefully over the back of a chair rather than putting it on, as though even now some part of him hesitated to fully claim the name it represented. "At my father's funeral, when I first understood what inheriting his title would require of me, and what it had already cost this family, through debts he left unpaid and choices he made that I have spent years trying quietly to undo." He looked at her then with a directness she had not seen from him since the night of the ring's discovery. "Tomorrow, before the king and every family gathered for the coronation, I intend to end the Bramfield claim entirely, using whatever authority the Rendlesham name still carries. But I will not do it, Clementine, without first knowing whether you can forgive the silence that brought us to this moment at all." She did not answer him immediately, needing the silence herself for once, turning over in her mind the whole of the weeks since the carriage had overturned. His hands, steady in the storm, his careful, rationed truths by the cottage fire, the closed door behind his eyes each time she had come too near the edge of his hidden name. "I do not yet know if I have forgiven it fully," she said finally, honestly. "But I know that the man who nursed my ribs and listened without flinching to what it cost me to be my father's daughter was real, whatever name he withheld from me. Wear the coat tomorrow, Gabriel. Whatever else remains unsettled between us, I would rather face the king beside the truth of you than beside the careful stranger you tried to be for my protection." Something eased visibly in his shoulders at that, not full forgiveness, but something adjacent to hope, and he left her that night with the coat still draped over the chair, waiting for morning. The coronation itself unfolded with a grandeur Clementine had heard described her whole life, but never witnessed directly. The great hall filled beyond capacity, with every family of consequence in England gathered beneath banners and candlelight to witness the king crowned. The air thick with incense and anticipation, and the particular hush that settles over even the most restless crowd in the moments before history properly begins. She stood with her father and Sabine near the edges of the assembly, her sister's hand finding hers discreetly beneath the fall of their skirts, a small, silent gesture of solidarity that told Clementine, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever Sabine had once owed their father's expectations, her loyalty in this moment belonged entirely to her sister instead. Lord Kavanagh, Earl of Bramfield, stood some distance across the hall with the settled confidence of a man who believed the day's proceedings would finally deliver him the settlement he had waited 2 decades to collect. His gaze finding Clementine once across the crowded space, with a coldness that reminded her precisely why she had refused him in the first place. Whatever cost that refusal might yet demand of her family's standing, she held his gaze without flinching, drawing on a steadiness she had not possessed before the cottage. Before Gabriel's steady hands and harder truths had taught her that her own worth did not depend on the approval of men like Kavanagh, or indeed, like her own father. It was near the ceremony's formal conclusion, once the king had been properly crowned, and the assembled peerage had begun the customary presentation of outstanding matters of honor and settlement before the new reign officially commenced, that the herald called the name Clementine had spent weeks half dreading and half longing to hear spoken aloud in full. Gabriel Ashworth, Earl of Rendlesham, come forward to address a matter of family debt before the crown. She watched him step from the crowd in the dark coat he had worn only once before, and understood, watching the hall's collective attention shift toward him with a ripple of recognition and murmured surprise, that whatever came next would be witnessed by every family whose good opinion had ever governed the shape of her life. The crown had barely settled. What came next would settle nothing quietly. Gabriel's voice, when he addressed the king directly, carried none of the careful, rationed quality she had grown accustomed to at the cottage's quiet hearth, but something clearer and harder instead, the voice of a man who had spent years preparing privately for a reckoning he had finally decided to make public. He spoke first of the old debt between the Sterne and Rendlesham families, acknowledging plainly and without evasion his own father's role in the reckless wager that had ruined Duke Alaric's finances decades before, a confession that visibly startled the assembled peerage. Unaccustomed to hearing any nobleman claim his own family's fault so openly before the crown, he spoke next, more carefully, of the settlement Bramfield had spent 20 years quietly engineering to collect against that old debt. A settlement built not on honor, he said, meeting Kavanagh's eyes directly across the hall, but on the calculated exploitation of a young woman who had never once been consulted about the price being paid on her behalf. It was when he turned, finally, from the king toward Clementine herself, drawing the room's full attention with him, that the hall's murmuring hush deepened into something absolute, a silence so complete that Clementine could hear her own pulse in her ears, could feel Sabine's hand tighten around hers, could see her father go entirely still beside her, as though bracing for a blow he had long dreaded, but never quite believed would fall in front of witnesses. Gabriel drew from inside his coat the very ring she had found hidden in its lining weeks before, the Rendlesham signet worn smooth with generations of use, and held it aloft before the king and the assembled court. "I ask your majesty's leave," he said, his voice carrying clear across the frozen hall, "to settle my family's old debt not through the collection Lord Bramfield has engineered, but through its complete forgiveness, and to ask, before this court and this crown, for the hand of Lady Clementine Sterne, not as payment owed by her family, but as the woman I have come, through her own courage and dignity, to love entirely on her own account." The room did not merely fall silent at the words. It froze in the way a held breath freezes, every face turning toward Clementine, where she stood at the edge of the assembly. Her father's carefully constructed indifference finally, publicly shattered. Bramfield's cold confidence collapsing visibly into fury he dared not voice before the king, and Clementine herself standing motionless at the center of it all, understanding with a clarity that stole the breath entirely from her chest that the man asking this of the crown had chosen, deliberately and before every family whose opinion had once determined her worth, to make her value undeniable in the one place it could never again be quietly buried. The king's assent, when it finally came, broke the frozen hall into a murmur of astonishment that rippled outward through the assembled peerage like water finally released from ice, and Clementine felt Sabine's hand squeeze hers once, hard, before her sister stepped back to let her cross the space that had opened between herself and Gabriel, every eye in that great hall following her passage with an attention she had spent her entire life being denied. Her father did not move from where he stood, his face carrying an expression she had never before seen him wear. Not quite shame, though shame moved somewhere beneath it, but the particular, unfamiliar humility of a man forced at last to witness publicly what he had spent 20 years refusing to acknowledge privately, that the daughter he had relegated to the far end of his table possessed a worth he had never once troubled himself to recognize. Lord Kavanaugh left the coronation before its formal conclusion, his claim against the Sterne family dissolved before the entire court, along with whatever cold advantage he had spent 2 decades patiently constructing. And Clementine understood, watching him go, that this quiet, public unmaking of his power over her family was its own form of justice, earned rather than merely granted. Gabriel took her hand before the assembled court. The ring that had once been hidden inside his coat's lining now offered openly, and when he spoke to her directly, low enough that only she could properly hear it beneath the hall's continuing murmur, his words held none of the careful evasion that had once separated them. "Whatever forgiveness you still owe me for the silence I kept," he said, "I intend to spend considerably longer than a single coronation earning it properly." She did not answer him with words, not yet, understanding that some debts of trust were not settled in a single grand gesture, however public or however costly to the man offering it, but built slowly, the way the cottage's quiet fire had been coaxed from wet kindling one careful, patient effort at a time. But she let him keep her hand as the assembled court began, gradually, to shift from shocked silence into the low murmur of a scandal already reshaping itself into legend, and understood, watching her father finally, belatedly, incline his head toward her in something that might have been the first genuine acknowledgement he had ever offered her across a room, that whatever remained unsettled between herself and Gabriel, she would no longer face the settling of it from the far end of anyone's table. The name spoken so often in her father's house only as apology or embarrassment now moved through the coronation hall instead as something closer to reverence. Lady Clementine Sterne, seen at last, and chosen, in the one place her worth could never again be quietly unmade.